Welcome everyone to the Beans for Lunch webinar series, and welcome back if you came to our first webinar that was focused on scouting dry beans and also primarily focused on insect pests. And this week, our webinar will be focused on dry bean diseases. And Sarah Pethybridge from Cornell, a plant pathologist from Cornell, will be our guest speaker today. And we were just commenting how all the rain and the humid weather is like good for disease, unfortunately. So it's a very timely webinar to learn more about diseases in dry beans and what to be looking for and how to manage those, because we have prime conditions for those pests. We do have a CCA credit that will be popped up at the end of the webinar today. So if you need a CCA credit, the QR code will show up after the webinar. And I just want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors, the USDA SARE program and the USDA NIFA Organic Research and Education Initiative program, and their generous funding to support our dry bean research here in the Northeast and beyond. We also have partners in Wisconsin or in the Midwest as well. So these are meant to be kind of short webinars, leaving plenty of time for questions. And so I just kind of don't want to spend too much time here. Ivy, did we have a whole question at the opening or no? I can't remember.
We were just going to ask folks to share any dry bean diseases that they're dealing with or ones that they deal with frequently. They could share that in the chat.
All right. So while you're listening to me blab away, and welcome everybody, if there are dry bean diseases that you're dealing with right now or have in the past, and you're wanting to make sure that Sarah comments on those, please make sure you put those in the chat. And if you have any photos too, and because you don't know what it is, you can upload those, I believe, pretty easily as well. All right, so this webinar is brought to you by the University of Vermont Extension and Cornell University. And our speaker today is Dr. Sarah Pethybridge, plant pathologist from Cornell AgriTech. So Sarah, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Heather. I'll just share my screen. Can you all see that? Yep. And feel free to interrupt me as we go through this presentation. This is meant to be a conversation about diseases rather than just me blabbering on about dry bean diseases. But it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to talk to you about one of my favourite topics, which is dry bean disease management. And we're right in the middle of the season. So there's some diseases that we will have already experienced, but it's good to recognise them. We may not be able to do something about them this year, but we can certainly incorporate them into our strategies for next year. And then there's other diseases which will come up from now until later in the season. And there's certainly something we can do to intervene with some of those diseases. So stand by. So the diseases we'll be talking about today fall into two groups, depending upon what they're caused by. Firstly, we'll talk about bacterial diseases, but we'll also be talking about the fungal diseases, and specifically the fungal diseases that we'll encounter from here on. And that's probably mostly white mold. So we'll be reviewing some of the symptoms of these diseases, the when and where we might encounter them, and some of the key management tactics that we can do within the season, but also some of the strategies if we've had an outbreak of a disease, what we can do to try and prevent that in the future. So just as a reminder on what is a disease, Well, it's not just the presence of our pathogen, our bacteria, or our fungi. We need these three factors to occur all at the same time to get disease in our fields. So we need the pathogen, we need the plant, of course, our dry bean plants, and we need susceptible in conducive environmental conditions. And the environment is going to differ. The most conducive environmental conditions are going to differ depending upon the disease that we deal with. And so we'll review some of those conditions more in a moment. So some of the things you may have already experienced with the wet start to the season is the impact upon plant populations or our crop stand through fungal root rots. So fungal root rots manifest themselves as either pre-emergent seedling death, post-emergent seedling disease, so the plant will come up through the soil and then die, and the above ground plant symptoms, if the plants do survive till later in the season, might be stunting of the plants, yellowing of the leaves, generally non-thriftiness of the plant. And when you pull those plants up, you might have these quite dramatic brown necrotic lesions at the soil lines that you can see here. This is caused by a fungal root rot caused by fungus fusarium, whereas this one on the lower side, you can see these brown spots slightly above the soil line as well. These are caused by another soil-borne fungus called Rhizoctonia solani. So fungal root rots, especially in wet, waterlogged soil and maybe wet, cold soil, may be one reason for poor crop stands. They're not seed-borne, they're only soil-borne, and they're generally exacerbated by abiotic stress, such as cold temperatures, and maybe compaction if it's been waterlogged and soil conditions weren't optimal at planting. And generally soils less than 60 degrees exacerbate root rots caused by these two fungi, mostly these two fungi, Fusarium and Rhizoctonia solani. So by knowing what the pathogens are that cause the disease, we can try and design crop rotations to try and minimize their effect on future dry bean crops because they're soil-borne only and not seed-borne. But one of these fungi, Rhizoctonia, also may cause issues later in the season. So if you've had issues with poor crop stands due to Rhizoctonia, there's probably a higher risk of seeing foliar blight. As you can see here, these sort of very dramatic bleached type lesions scattered throughout the foliage, also caused by this fungus. And if the pods are more likely to contact the ground, either through a variety or crop lodging or through a storm, for example, has pushed the canopy over, you may also see disease caused by Rhizoctonia on the pods, as you can see here. So sort of bleached looking lesions, random spots across the pods. So again, that's an indication of Rhizoctonia present in the soil. And if that's an issue, we can certainly take that into account in our crop rotations in the future as well. So in terms of root rot management, there's not a lot that we can do from now on. Our plant populations are already set. So there's minimal within season intervention, but it's really strategies, things that we can do prior to planting, which are going to try and reduce our crop loss caused by root rots in the future. So if it has been problematic in certain fields in the past, we can try and incorporate that information into our crop rotation plans. Other diseases that you may have seen already in your dry bean crops and may continue to see throughout the season are those caused by bacteria. Now, there's 3 different diseases caused by bacteria which are more common in the northeast. The first of these is brown spot, and it's caused by a bacterium known as Pseudomonas syringae. It causes these interesting lesions on the leaves. They're brown or necrotic, what we call, And you can tell that they may be caused by a bacterium because of these yellow rings or yellow halos around these symptoms. So you might see symptoms of brown spot on the foliage, but you may also see them on the pods, as you can see here. The lesions don't get very large. They generally less than around 1/8 of an inch in diameter. They're generally circular, but they always have this yellow ring. They can sometimes often occur in lines or veins along the leaf because the leaf wetness will accumulate in those areas and therefore exacerbate infection. And when those lesions dry out, you can get the center of those lesions falling out, and the leaf might look like has a shot hole type appearance, as you can see one here that's more advanced and cracking compared to the others. Now, there's two other bacterial diseases you may also encounter. The first of these is halo blight. It's a lot more dramatic in its appearance rather than just small necrotic lesions. It's caused by a similar bacterium, again, another Pseudomonas syringae, but a different type of bacterium. And the lesions are generally a lot larger, the yellow to green halos around the lesions again, which is characteristic of most bacterial diseases, but they're a lot larger. Their upper side is a red type color, and again, they occur on the foliage and the pods. Now, you may also encounter common blight, which is caused by a different bacterium. This one's a Xanthomonas. And again, the symptoms occur on the foliage and the pods. They usually start off as small water-soaked lesions on the undersides of the leaves and then progress to those brown, dry and brittle type symptoms that were similar to those other bacterial diseases, but it may cover a larger area of the leaves compared to brown spot, which are usually quite small lesions. This one is a lot more damaging than the other two bacterial diseases. It can dramatically impact yield, reduce the number of pods, and of course, we may also encounter poor seed quality within the infected pods as well. So in general, these bacterial diseases are necrotic lesions with that yellow halo, and differentiating between them can be quite tricky, but it's generally the size and appearance of the lesions. Now, for all of these bacterial diseases, the pathogens generally survive in crop residues, so residues of previous crops which may also be hosts. They can also be seed transmitted, they can be soil-borne, and they can survive on weeds as well as alternative hosts. But in terms of crop rotation, the key information is that the host range mostly consists of all beans. They don't discriminate against beans. So it's lima beans, snap beans, soya beans, which is probably more important in our rotations, and broad beans. So making sure we've got a rotation away from other beans, not just dry beans, is also important for planning crop rotations in the future. The spread among and between fields, so the dispersal of the pathogen, is usually driven by wet weather, hail, rain, windstorms, everything that we've mostly been encountering this season. So perfect weather for bacterial disease spread this year. But the weather will also drive the conducive conditions for the disease. So for brown spot and common blight, they tend to be exacerbated by warm temperatures, so 80 to 85, whereas halo blight is favoured by cooler temperatures, 70 to 75. So really there's a bacterial disease out there for every different situation. I would if I was a bacterium, I would certainly like the 70 to 75 rather than the 80 to 85, but they seem to cover all bases. So in terms of bacterial disease management, things that we can do within the season, if we do have a problem or watching the problem, the most impactful thing really is to get on it quickly. So if we do have an outbreak of bacterial diseases, knowing that it's out there. So scouting regularly is really important because these diseases can spread quite rapidly, and especially in the environmental conditions we're experiencing this season. So really, if we want to try and prevent the spread of bacterial diseases, no matter what bacterial disease we're dealing with, the strategy is almost the same. So generally, our only option for sprays are copper-based sprays, and they're generally put on mid-vegetative or early flowering periods, so getting to the stage now. Because they're copper-based protectant sprays, one of the most important things to getting the most out of your investment in copper is ensuring good spray coverage. So if you've got a thick canopy, making sure you've got the right water volume and the most appropriate nozzles for getting spray penetration into the canopy. Now, of course, there's coppers for conventional production and there's coppers for organic production. So those are formulations that are OMRI listed. And we've done a lot of trials over the years with different coppers and different diseases. And we believe that generally all coppers are the same as long as you use them at the maximum labeled rate in terms of their disease control efficacy. Now, there are differences in terms of maximum labeled rate, cost, mixing, usage, the ease of usage in mixing. So some may block nozzles compared to others. But as long as you use them at the maximum labeled rate and treat them as protectants, they're not going to cure the disease. They're only going to protect future infections. You will get the most out of your investment. The other disease you might encounter from mid-season now to harvest is a disease called anthracnose. Anthracnose is a fungal disease. It's caused by a fungus called Coleototricum lindomathium. And these are the typical symptoms that you might see on the foliage. So they're rust brown to black lesions, mostly on the petioles of the leaves and possibly the leaf veins. And they're more round but sunken eye spot type lesions. They can be particularly aggressive and spread quite rapidly. So if it's earlier on in the season, it can also kill individual plants, but usually they cause general defoliation and unthriftiness. But anthracnose can also get into the pods, and it can cause these quite dramatic black or brown type lesions. And those black and brown type lesions are usually associated with these orangey colour around them. And those are the spores of the fungus, which are going to be dispersed to infect other plant parts. So overall, the major impact of anthracnose is on pod quality and seed quality as well. So one of the characteristics of anthracnose is, again, similar to bacterial diseases. The spores are spread by rain splash. We're encountering frequent moderate rainfall, which is conducive to the disease. It's got a very wide temperature range, so it's happy either way, right down to 55 degrees and up to 80, but it really likes high relative humidity, over 92%. Now, things that we can do within the season. Well, we could apply fungicides if it's becoming an issue. And a lot of the fungicides that have efficacy for white mold, which I'll talk about more in a moment, are also going to pick up control of anthracnose. So I'll talk more about optimal timing for fungicides in a moment. And then planning for the future, thinking about crop rotations as well, away from beans for at least 3 years, all beans, not just dry beans. But one of the most damaging diseases affecting dry beans from mid-season to harvest is white mold, of course. White mold is caused by the fungus Sclerotinia sclerodiorum, and one of the major reasons it's such a problem is that it has a very broad host range. So crop rotation is not always effective, as it could be in other systems, to try and break that inoculum carryover cycle between seasons. So it infects many of our field crops, vegetable crops, and our broadleaf weeds as well. So I'm sure if you're a dry bean grower, you would have been familiar with white mold symptoms, but here's a picture of some. There's bleached brown lesions, as you can see here, on the stems and the pods. It doesn't usually affect the leaves directly. And the telltale thing that it's white mold is that we're getting the production of this white cottony mycelia on those diseased plant parts. And after you get the production of this white cottony mycelia, you get the production of the black sclerotia. Now, the sclerotia are the resting bodies of the fungus that fall back into the soil surface, and in that way, it can survive between seasons to cause disease in subsequent crops. So generally on the stems and pods, but sometimes when you're scouting, it's hard to see those symptoms because they're way down in the canopy. But sometimes you have a flag leaf, so a leaf that's sort of wilting singly on a stem. That indicates that there's generally something wrong lower down in the canopy. And often when you part the canopy, then you can see white mold symptoms. So sometimes the most obvious things to look for are those flag leaves at the top of the canopy. Now, white mold, again, bringing in that disease triangle concept, pathogen, Sclerotinia sclerotiorum, is usually present enough in the soil because of that broad host range to cause disease if the conditions are conducive. And in dry beans, there's not a lot of significant resistance or immunity to our cultivars, which would change our crop protection practices. So it's really the environment that drives whether we get white mold in a particular year or not. But often it's this white mold mystery, from what I say. It's when to get the most out of your crop protection practices. Often there's a mystery about where it's going to occur, trying to predict whether you're going to get white mold or not. And then the next part of the mystery is how. What are we going to select as the most effective crop protection product if we decide to use those for white mold management throughout the season? So let's explore the when, where, and how in further detail. So often it's a decision around whether to spray a fungicide or not. And to get the most out of those fungicides, you're investing in crop protection, is to use them as protectants and not curatives. So often if you're already at the stage of seeing white mold, you've already had a lot of infection, those fungicides are not going to cure the infection, they're only going to protect the further developing flowers. And I'll get to that more in a moment. So this is the life cycle that is interesting to understand to get the most out of your fungicides. So those sclerotia, the black resting bodies of the fungus in the soil, germinate. They then produce spores, which fly off and are wind dispersed. But the only way they can infect a bean plant is through the flowers. It doesn't matter if there's lots of foliage. If there's no flowers, they're not going to infect, because they infect the flowers, use those petals as when they're dying as a nutrient source to infect the foliage. So we can use this information to try and get the most out of our fungicides. We need to protect the flowers. So when judging the long-term risk of white mold, whether you're going to get white mold in a particular field or not, we can take into account the history. So if we've had susceptible crops in that field, have they had white mold before? If they have, of course, then there's a higher risk because there'll be more sclerotia present in the soil. Now, also topography also influences white mold risk. So the undulating landscape that we experience in New York and Vermont and elsewhere is perfect for enhancing the conditions for white mold. Poor air drainage around sites that might be surrounded by trees, for example, anything where relative humidity is high, and leaf wetness is going to extend, also make the field more conducive for white mold, assuming the inoculum is present in the soil. So when drilling that down further, the risk factors for white mold are, well, it likes cool conditions like me, less than 85 degrees Fahrenheit, normal or above normal rainfall, similar to this year, soil moisture at or above field capacity. But if it's too wet, that can also be deleterious to the survival of the sclerotia. So if you have flooding, for example, that will kill the sclerotia because they like oxygenated environment. Morning fog and high relative humidity, which keeps the leaves wet, are also exacerbating white mold. So in terms of the risk factors to the crop, a cropping history, like a higher frequency of crops in that field that will be susceptible to white mold, which is most of our field and vegetable crops. If the particular crop has an early or dense canopy closure, high plant populations or excessive plant nitrogen, that also exacerbates the risk of white mold. And weed management, of course. So if there's a lot of broadleaf weeds, even when we've grown non-susceptible hosts, like corn and cereals, then they may also serve as alternative hosts to keep the inoculum going in that field. But overall, cool, wet weather is favourable for both the pathogen and the crop because it often extends the flowering window in dry bean. And even though dry beans tend to already flower for quite a long time, that could be extended and there could be more flowers because flowers, again, are the only infection point for the fungus. So often there's a lot of debate about, well, where is it going to occur? There has been some apps developed from the Midwest, and Sporecaster is one that was developed at the University of Wisconsin. So what Sporecaster does is evaluates if the weather has been favourable for the germination of the sclerotia into those mushroom structures which produce the spores. So it takes into account a 30-day average of the maximum temperature, relative humidity and maximum wind speed for drying the canopy and dispersing the spores. And all you have to do is provide in the app the GPS coordinates of your field, and I'll show you more about that in a moment. This app was developed for soybeans, so the crop parameters that you can alter are more related to soybean production. So you can say whether it's irrigated or not, and whether it's on a 15-inch or a 30-inch row spacing. So not as ideal for dry beans, but it's an indication of whether you're going to have weather that is conducive for sclerotia. So as I mentioned, this app was developed by Damon Smith, who's a plant pathologist, field crop pathologist at the University of Wisconsin. This is what the launch page looks like. It's got 3 different options, a new field, field list, and more information. But I'm just going to walk you through the various steps when we go to new field. So that when we click on new field, you can enter a field name, for example. You can specify the row spacing, the irrigation, and you can find your particular field on a map, on a Google map, and select that location. So you don't have to know the GPS coordinates on your own. You can also specify more details of the crop, whether the flowers are present or not at this particular location, whether you've got row closure, the date that you can work it backwards or forwards, and you can then select to run the model. So again, this was developed for soybeans. It probably requires some optimization for dry beans and probably some local testing for the Northeast, but it's just an indication to try and support your thoughts about whether it is a white mold year and or location for your particular crop. Then you can select to run the model, and it will give you the results in a traffic light type system. So a red one means that the risk is high, and then green and yellow not so high, for example. So you could interpret the results. You can have multiple fields that you're considering if you've got multiple different microclimatic conditions. So again, that app is called Sporecaster. It was developed for white mold in soybeans in the Midwest, so it hasn't been locally tested in the Northeast, but it gives you an indication. And it's available for Android and iPhone, free download. There's another app that was also developed by the University of Wisconsin. It's called Field Prophet. And again, it's got a range of different crops, and it's all about trying to predict disease. One of those is white mold in soybeans, but you may have also heard about a new disease, tar spot in field corn. It also incorporates prediction of the risk of that disease. Now, it's only available for iPhone. It's not free, but it's only a small charge. But it does, instead of just giving you the risk on one particular day, it does give you a 7-day historical trend in the risk for each location, using the same models for white mold as was in Sporecaster. So you can see if things are heading in the right direction for disease or not. So just as a reminder, fungicides are protective, they can't be curative. And if investing in crop protection, trying to protect those flowers from infection by Sclerotinia is the key to getting the most out of your fungicides. So what are we going to spray if we do decide that strategy? Well, in terms of conventional sprays, these are the ones that are registered for white mold in dry bean in New York. And if you're in another state, I'd encourage you to check your own local regulations as well. But all of these have excellent efficacy for the control of white mold. In our trials, there was not a lot of difference between them, but we found that the majority, to get the most out of these products, you need to be able to apply them early, so 1% flowering. So that is 1% of plants with at least one open flower. And then in dry beans, there's value in putting a second application on in about 10 days' time. So whereas in snap beans, where we have determinate flowering, we only see value from one fungicide application. In dry beans, where we have indeterminate flowering, so flowering goes on, we see value in applying the 2 applications. And as long as you're putting them on at the correct rate, at the higher rates, and putting them on at the right time, we don't see a lot of difference between them. Now, there's differences in terms of pros and cons with regards to the pre-harvest interval. It's worth noting that Omega has a 30-day PHI to harvest, pre-harvest interval. And there's also some differences in terms of their modes of action, recognised by their FRAC group, Fungicide Resistance Action Committee group. So to try and prevent resistance, you might want to use one from group 7 and one from a group 3 or a group 1, for example. And they're also of differential cost as well. For example, Topsin, there's generics as well, and it's a lot cheaper than the others such as Endura or Omega, where there aren't generic film formulations available. Now, if you're in organic production, we've also done a lot of screening looking at the efficacy of different OMRI listed products for use within the season. And the principle is the same, to try and protect those flowers from infection. Now, the ones we've had most success with contain a Bacillus amylocaceae strain. And here's 2 different strains with 2 different formulations from 2 different companies. One's called Double Nickel from Certis Biologicals, and Stargus is from MBI. We didn't find any difference between them, but we found that these particular active ingredients were the most efficacious for the control of white mold. We tend to avoid copper over flowering in dry beans because it can be phytotoxic and cause premature flower abscission with high temperatures. So that's why we were looking at a lot of the different microbial biopesticides for white mold control over flowering, whereas copper on the foliage will be your best option for bacterial disease control, of course. Now, those are things that we can do within the season. Of course, we're also looking ahead and trying to be proactive to try and reduce the risk of diseases in future years. So looking ahead to 2025. Some of the most impactful things are using certified, disease-free and treated, if possible, seed for conventional production, obviously certified seed for organic production. So making sure that we're not introducing some of those really aggressive seed-borne pathogens into our field to start with, so we don't even have to deal with them. Crop rotation is another completely impactful production practice for a lot of these pathogens. So a lot of these pathogens have beans in general as their host range, as we saw with the bacterial pathogens. Anthracnose, this is not the case for white mold, but for some of those other pathogens, rotating away from beans for at least 3 years is our recommendation. Now, if we've had an outbreak of white mold this year, we can look at ways to try and minimize the impact or minimize the carryover of that inoculum so it doesn't cause as much disease as it could in subsequent crops in future years. So for sclerotia, the resting body of the fungus that causes white mold, we recommend not leaving them on the soil surface. And if you can, do some shallow tillage to try and cover them with soil that promotes their degradation. And in our trials in New York, that promoted degradation in a faster rate than if we left them on the soil surface subject to the elements. And of course, crop residues management also comes into our thoughts about what we do after a disease outbreak. So many of those pathogens, anthracnose, the rhizoctonias, the bacterial pathogens also survive in crop residue. So we also encourage you to consider incorporating them promptly to try and encourage decomposition at a faster rate, similar to the strategy for sclerotia. Now, I wanted to end there, so I'm happy to answer questions, but I wanted to also acknowledge our funding body, the Organic Research and Extension Initiative, which funds our dry bean work, trying to enhance the industry in the Northeast, and also the University of Vermont for having me today. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. That was awesome. So much great information. So if anyone has questions for Sarah, if you want to put them into the chat or just unmute yourself, there's, not too many of us on here. So I think that would be appropriate if you have a question for Sarah. Sarah, what have you heard anything from growers? Is everyone having every issue? Is it?
Yeah. So we had a lot of incidents of sort of fungal root rots early in the season.
Yeah.
When we were forced to sort of plant into coolish wet ground because time was running out into mid-June or so. And then it turned quite hot and we had that really hot period for a whole week. So that slowed everything down and caused some crusting issues with emergence. If it was at the right time. And then we're just really going into flowering now. So considering white mold risk in our crop.
I've seen a lot of white mold this year just in our snap beans.
Oh, right.
So I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a field of black beans at our research farm and they're approaching flowering next week. So we'll be
I'm not sure if you mentioned this. I was trying to get my internet going again, but we have had a lot of leafhopper issues this year. Is that going to result in more bacterial blight? I know they are really great for moving things around. Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
So they cause injury, which may exacerbate bacterial infection. Have you seen much hopper burn at all?
Yeah, there's been a lot, and I know some of the farmers have had to spray.
Right.
It's been quite bad this year.
Okay.
Oh.
Yep. So certainly a risk factor, and just keeping an eye out for bacterial diseases.
Okay.
So Giovanna, you asked about, are there seed treatments or soaps that can help with pathogens? Not that I'm aware of, because a lot of the bacterial pathogens that are transmitted by seed are internal. So they can survive on the outside of the seed, but a lot of them survive in the seed, in the embryo. So a lot of those seed treatments don't actually penetrate the seed, so they're less efficacious. Sorry, Giovanna.
Are there any organic seed treatments that you've looked at, Sarah?
Yeah, so we've looked at a range of the root, the trichoderma type based formulations, mostly for anthracnose control. And we tried copper as well, OMRI listed coppers like Coava and just as a soak, but we didn't find any efficacy, unfortunately. So we're still out there hunting.
Yeah. Okay.
Have you tried anything, Heather?
No, we haven't. We have been just gearing up to try ozone treatment, and Giovanna's been helping us with that. We've had a farmer that has been using ozone to actually treat seed, and it has helped in small grains.
Okay.
So we're wondering about dry beans as well. So we'll see.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think for some farmers, they're growing heirloom seed or heirloom types or varieties and accessing, treated seed or clean seed can be really challenging. So people tend to save their own.
Yeah.
And do you have any suggestions on that?
I mean, it's not the best practice, because if you've had even a small amount of pathogen present or disease in the field that you may not have been able to detect, it might be exacerbated if you're carrying over seed. But I certainly understand the challenges in trying to source clean seed for the different varieties. Yep.
So if there's any questions for Sarah, please feel free to put them in the chat. I know sometimes people just like to hear what other people are saying. One question I had was about timing. And again, you might have covered this when I was having my internet issues, but if we're not seeing much disease right now, would you recommend that, because of the weather conditions, that we go out and spray some of these biologicals or coppers as protectants?
The white mold?
For anything?
So if you're heading into flowering and encountering high temperatures, sort of above 80, 85, copper can be a bit of a risk.
Okay, that's what you said.
Premature flower abscission. But we have experienced that in our trials. So if you're still at an early stage of growth, then that may be worthwhile. Only if you're seeing symptoms. So probably, by scouting the fields, checking out if you've got a low level diseases before probably trying to make that decision. Whereas for white mold, it's going to become more tricky. We're getting conducive conditions. You're seeing white mold up in your area already. It's likely going to be a white mold year, so to speak.
Yeah.
So the way to get the most out of your fungicides or OMRI listed products is to do them proactively. So at, often we say 1% flowering, it could be 10% flowering, because that window of early flowering can go quite rapidly at high temperatures. So early flowering, it's probably good to put the first one on, and then we tend to put the second one on in about 10 to 14 days time, depending on if you're dealing with either a conventional synthetic product, which could probably stretch out further, or a OMRI listed product where we tend to shorten the reapplication interval.
Okay.
About 7 days.
I see Charlie has a couple of questions, Sarah, about protectants for anthracnose and seed treatments.
Yep. So in terms of, Charlie, protectants for anthracnose on the foliage, like within season? So a lot of those for anthracnose, if you've got foliar symptoms and trying to prevent spread of that disease symptoms to the pods, then you might consider some of the white mold type fungicides. So a lot of those are also going to be effective for anthracnose. I'd probably pick the group 3, which is the Proline 1.
Okay.
Or Endura, which is group 7. Now, I haven't tested our OMRI listed products as a foliar application for anthracnose. So the ones that I suggested were good for white mold control, I don't know for anthracnose, but may also pick it up. So those are the Bacillus amyloquafaciens strains. So double nickel and Stargus. Yeah, so in terms of seed treatments for conventional for root rots, what are you using at the moment, Charlie?
Well, I grow a lot of heirloom beans, a lot of different varieties, and naturally there's always can be problems with seed or with the soil.
Yep.
I treat the seed now by myself using Cruiser, which helps a lot on leaf hoppers.
Yep.
And which are a big problem in our organic fields.
Okay.
But I've not used like a fungicide on the seed as well. I mean, I also use inoculate to treat the seeds at the same time I add Cruiser.
Yep. Yeah, so the one there you've listed, Apron, is a conventional synthetic fungicide that will be good for the lower type fungi, like Phytophythiums and things that are going to exacerbate seedling loss in colder and wet conditions. Another one would be Maxim. I'll type it in the control in the chat. And that has more activity towards Rhizoctonias.
Okay.
Yep. Another one would be Thyram. That is also applied as a seed treatment in some cases, and that would have more efficacy for anthracnose. But both conventional synthetic fungicides.
Right. If there's any more questions for Sarah, please feel free to type them in or just unmute yourself. If you need CCA credits, those just went up. Ivy put up the QR code so you can scan that. Yeah, any other questions for Sarah? We will be recording. We have recorded this and we will be posting it on our website. So if you need to go back and refer to it, you can. I'm trying to scan the QR code, but it won't work. Anyway.
I'll type in my email address as well, but feel free to contact me at any time as well.
Great. I know that people, that watched that came to your presentation at the grain conference. Sarah really appreciated all the information you offered. So thank you for doing that too.
Love the grain conference. It's a fantastic spot. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, if there aren't any further questions for Sarah, I don't know, Ivy, if you can make that bigger or if it's just me, the QR code. Maybe it's just me.
Let me try again.
Okay. If folks need that, I don't know why it's not. It could, again, might just be me, just wouldn't show up.
I have it on full screen. I'm not sure that I can make it any larger.
Right. I think it's me. I think it's my phone. It's probably dirty. Yeah, it goes to a dead link, it says. Thanks, Giovanna. Thanks for yeah. So if anybody needs credits, please just reach back out to us and we'll make sure that we fix whatever's going on there.
And Susan put her email in the chat for folks to send that to her.
Okay, great. All right, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, so much for your time today. Once again, we appreciate it. And we will be distributing the video link out to everybody and sharing that so people can refer back to it. And like Sarah said, if you do have any questions, she's happy to answer those. And I hope everybody enjoys this much cooler, dry day.
Yeah.
Oh, Sarah, quick question, actually, I meant to ask you. We had a lot of flooding here in Vermont on many bean fields, soybean and dry beans.
Right.
Have you dealt with that in your time in New York, and any, words of caution or things to be looking out for? They, some of the beans did get covered with silt. They're pretty dirty. The water did recede pretty quickly, but I imagine that might.
Yeah, so it could be more of a problem for Rhizoctonia on the pods. So Rhizoctonia is carried on the soil, and if it's stuck to the pods and injured that way, or that could be more of a risk issue for later in the season. Or I guess, did they have pods?
No, no pods. So yeah, no, things were probably just starting to flower for some people.
Okay. Yep. So if the soil has been anoxic, so it doesn't have oxygen because of flooding, that may actually decrease your white mold risk. Probably because the canopy is
kinds of good news.
Not as thrifty. Yeah. And the sclerotia will tend to die quite quickly when the soil is flooded. Flooding is actually as a control.
I know I see Seth is on here, and he had some beans that were flooded, and he said the one good thing was, Charlie, you'll love this, that the leaf hoppers all washed away.
Right.
Didn't have to spray. So I don't think it's not a great pest management strategy, but
yeah, right? Can you hear me okay here, Heather?
Yep.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking. I was like, that's one of the few benefits of the floodwaters is the two varieties that I had that the leaf hoppers are worst in got completely flooded for less than 24 hours. But when I went back out to check the field, the leaves were pretty covered in silt, but there wasn't a single leaf hopper in the field. So that was one benefit. But oh well.
Yeah.
But yeah, Sarah, I got to sit in on your presentation at the grain conference, and yeah, again, I reiterate what Heather was saying. We really appreciate your expertise, and especially for some of these heirloom varieties that not many people grow. We appreciate your experience and advice and different treatments and things we can do from an organic standpoint too, because there's not always a lot of information out there.
Yeah.
So
thank you. I love Vermont. It's one of my favorite states. I've got any excuse to go to Vermont. Yeah. Cool.
Well, again, thank you everyone. And we will be posting Sarah's webinar so that people can, you know, refer back to it as well. And enjoy the rest of this beautiful day. I'm gonna go combine some canola, hopefully.
Well,
Yeah, hopefully. I'll be looking for white mold, Sarah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.